certified sommelier Beverly Crandon, and welcome to the Wine Down, where we talk about all things wine and make it highly approachable. And on today's Wine Down, we're doing a 101 on South African wine. Hey wine friends, today we're diving into the fantastic world of South African wines. Listen, if you are someone who's interested in exploring regions that are diverse and have a lot to offer, but then also not often talked about or widely talked about, then this video is going to be for you. South Africa, I love it, and I love the wines from South Africa because they've got such a rich history. There's a variety of grapes for you to explore, and the price points aren't that terrible. They're pretty good and affordable, making it highly approachable. And there's a grape, I guarantee you, from South Africa just waiting for you to discover it. So let's begin. Let's get into this South African Wine 101 session today. Before we get into the wines themselves, let's have a pretty quick history lesson on South Africa wine and grape growing. Now, grape growing really began to happen in South Africa in the 1600s, and that was with the Dutch settlers. South Africa was along their path, their spice route path. And so South Africa became a port, if you will, where they could stop, get some rest, get more supplies. It was an area where they can get rejuvenated for the rest of their trip, their voyage. And so naturally, being European, they were accustomed to drinking vino with meals and so forth. So it made sense for them to naturally plant vines right around Cape Town. Now, despite some ups and downs, one of them namely being in the late 1800s, a horrible bout with phylloxera, like the rest of the world, right? And then some political challenges. Today, what we're seeing is that South Africa has emerged as a powerhouse when it comes to wine. Now, I think it's important as we talk about political challenges and we talk about the story and the history of South African wine, that we mention the impact that apartheid had to play here. In addition to stifling a nation of people in South Africa, the country was subject to sanctions because of its treatment under apartheid of Black South Africans. These sanctions meant that they couldn't export their wines globally. It also meant that they were unable to benefit from some of the achievements and advancements that were happening on an international scene. Now, with the end of apartheid, we saw a couple of things. Obviously, betterment for the people and for the country as a whole. But when it comes to wine, they were now able to share those wines internationally, but also benefit from the wine sharing knowledge that was going on in the industry that they weren't a part of. And those things, especially after apartheid, helped to even further elevate the industry in South Africa. This history leads to what you have now, right? Which is beautiful. It is, you're seeing a wine region or wine country that's taking old traditions and blending it with new innovative ways of making wine. And what you have are wine styles that are classic, but yet nuanced. All right, now let's get into wine regions, right? So where in South Africa are these wines being grown? What's funny is the most common area for growing wine almost forms a circle around Cape Town. But each of these regions has a distinct vibe, their own vibe. Let's get started with Stellenbosch, right? Stellenbosch is the big star, famous for rich reds like Cabernet Sauvignon and Bordeaux style blends. Then let's look at another big one, which is Paarl. Paarl offers a mix of styles and is great for both reds and whites. We can't have a discussion about regions and not talk about the Swartland. It's a bit wilder and warmer here, so it's known for bold, fruity reds like its Shiraz. And also some Chenin Blancs too, you'll see that there. Another big one for me, I especially like it because it's coastal, cooler, is Walker Bay. And it's perfect for growing Pinot Noir and some crisp whites. And then, we have places like Elgin in the Cape South Coast. And it is known and now being celebrated for growing things like Chardonnay, Riesling, Sauvignon Blanc, Pinot Noir, some Shiraz. Its high elevation and cooler climate makes it an area truly, truly, truly worthy of exploration. In all, South Africa has about 60 appellations under its wines of origin system, and each one is distinct, right? And there's no better way, to me anyways, to explore these regions than just tasting through them. Now let's dig into the grapes. Although South Africa does, I think it's over 50 grape varietals, there are what I call the big six that you should really know coming out of South Africa. And I'm going to go through them in order of most planted to least, but the top six of that 50 we talked about. So number one, can you guess? Chenin Blanc. So Chenin Blanc is the most wildly planted grape in South Africa and white grape in South Africa. About 18% of the country's plantings is planted to Chenin Blanc. But what's even more startling as a statistic, South Africa and their Chenin production represents 53% of the world's production of Chenin Blanc. That is amazing. And we have a post up on the website where we do a deep dive into Chenin Blanc. It's a 3-part series. And you get to see how other people, old world countries, are looking at South Africa's Chenin Blanc production and thinking how it might be, a way for them to understand what's going to happen with global warming and so forth. So with climate change. Take a look at that. Here's the QR code for that. Enjoy. But with your Chenin Blanc, you're going to expect the lovely pear, crisp acidity, some honey. It truly is delightful. And Chenin Blanc from South Africa, you are getting them, like even in the Loire, you're getting them in a dry style, sweet style, and then some sparkling Chenin coming out of South Africa. Just delicious. All right, so now let's move on to the second most planted. And this one's going to be tricky for you. It is a red grape, but it's not Pinotage. Can you guess? It's Cabernet Sauvignon. I mentioned Pinotage here because when people talk about South Africa and they talk about wines, they always mention Pinotage. Pinotage is quintessential South African, and you can't have a conversation about South African wine without mentioning Pinotage, but it is not as highly planted as Cabernet Sauvignon. Cabernet Sauvignon represents about 11% of the country's planting and is the most wildly planted red grape in the country. And if you think of wine production like a business, it only makes sense. As a farmer or a grape grower, I'm going to grow what I know I'm going to have a better chance at selling internationally. Cabernet Sauvignon today is the most planted red grape and is the most sold red wine. So it's a business. So even though Pinotage is what my country is known for, I still have to pay the bill. So Cabernet Sauvignon is my second most planted. Cab Savs here, you can get it different types of structures depending on the region, but think of your, grippier tannins, bold red fruit, black currant, blackberry. That's the type of thing. Quite delicious, really. So let's move on to the third. Our third most planted grape in South Africa is Sauvignon Blanc. And it is known and loved for its gooseberry, passion fruit aromas. Depending on where it's grown, this too can have a healthy amount of acidity. It thrives in cooler regions in South Africa. So think of Elgin, like we just talked about. A super, super stunner there. So 10% of the plantings is that, and it is the second most planted white grape in South Africa. Moving on to the fourth. Our fourth most planted grape in South Africa is Shiraz, which I have here in my glass. It is a wonderful sipper. This represents about 10%, a little under 10% of the country's plantings, and is the second most planted red grape. So just behind Cabernet Sauvignon, then you've got your Shiraz. The grape here thrives in warmer climates, warmer inland climates, but some coastal expressions are just delightful. You're gonna get your grippy tannins, there's gonna be some extraction around the glass, but you've got a good blend of acidity and some earthy notes, some herbal notes on here. Such a wonderful sipper, black, blue, red fruit, gorgeous. And that is the Shiraz production out of South Africa. After that, you're going to another big noble grape, Chardonnay. Chardonnay represents about 8% of the plantings in South Africa. And again, it's a grape that shows its style, even though it takes a lot from the winemaking, but that green apple is still there. That lovely bright citrus is still there. That pear is still there. And that's 8% of what's growing out of South Africa. Now, the last of the big six wait for it, is Pinotage. You're probably like, when is she going to talk about Pinotage? I'm talking about it now. So Pinotage is the last of the big six in terms of plantings. And again, it definitely makes sense. You're going to, if a known grape varietal can thrive in your geography, you're going to want to plant a healthy amount of that to make sure you can pay the bills. But then you also want to make sure you pay homage to things that are quintessential to your area and to your country, and that is Pinotage. If you've not had a Pinotage, think really big, bold reds, grippy tannins, dark fruit on there. And one thing I will warn people about, some folks will say I'm not fond of Pinotage. I've tried Pinotage wines from across South Africa, across many of the different regions, and there is such a difference if you go from inland, lowland to high elevation, coastal. The Pinotage, there are still some traits that are still it. It's going to be dark and brooding, but it has some other elements that come into it based on the terroir. Do not paint all South African Pinotage with the same brush. And that's about, I want to say 7%, 7.5% of the country's plantings, okay? So those are the big six. You've got your Chenin Blanc in number one, Cabernet Sauvignon, Sauvignon Blanc, then you've got your Syrah or Shiraz, then you have your Chardonnay, and then you have your Pinotage. That's the big six that you need to know out of South Africa. But honorable mention goes to Merlot, which is about 6.5% of the plantings there in South Africa, and being planted more widely. Merlot has been known, especially ones coming from South Africa, for its medium to full body, but it's highly approachable, easy to drink. And again, as I mentioned, South Africa produces over 50 grape varieties. So there's so many things for you to explore, but those are the big six that you need to know. So now let's talk a bit about some tips and tricks to know what to buy when you're in your store when it comes to South African wine. You know, we showed you the map earlier, which showed you regions that were coastal, more inland, and it had some tips on elevation. And if you have been following wine and reading about wine quite a bit, you know that when grapes are grown more inland, you've got more ripeness, more warmth. There's less cooling mitigating features happening there. Whereas if you go coastal, now you're getting into some maybe marine influences and higher acidity because you've got some impacts and benefits from being coastal and from that water. So be mindful of that. Know what works for you and your palate, what you kind of like. But the other thing I want to point out when you're buying your South African wine is look for that wines of origin seal on the back label and sometimes on the front label. What that wine of origin seal will tell you is where the wine is from. More important, where the grapes are from. So in order for me to put the name of a region, district, or ward on my label, it means the grapes in here in my bottle, 100% of them come from that geographical area. With region being higher, then district, then ward. Ward being like a smaller geographical area of unique terroir and so forth. So goes region, district, ward. You see any of those on my bottle is telling you that 100% of the grapes came from that area. The other thing that you will see on the bottle, if I'm using vintage, so the year of the wine, so 1999, for example, that means that 85% of the grapes in my bottle have to be from that vintage. And then if I'm putting the variety, so the grape name on the bottle, I'm calling it Chenin Blanc, it means that 85% of the grapes in the bottle need to be Chenin Blanc. And so very much so on par with what you see in the EU. I guess my point today is, if you're new to South African wine, is that you got to dig in. You got to get in there. The South African wine will surprise you in many ways in terms of the varieties that are there, the quality, the price, its affordability. You got to just go in, get a bottle and try it. Whether you want something crisp, you're going for that Chenin Blanc, or you want something meaty and smoky, so you're going for like Pinotage, which is quintessential South African. There's something there. Explore it and find out what South African wine and grape and even region sings to you. Thanks for joining me on this South African wine adventure. Listen, if you love this beginner's guide, please like, subscribe, hit the bell for more wine tips, share. And I think that's it for now. Thank you for joining me on the Wine Down, where today we talk about everything South African wine. Cheers to your next bottle and next glass of South African wine. Today's last word. I remember studying wine to become certified, and there were times where those instructing would say some things about South African wine that painted it not in a good light. And as a young student, you're listening very attentively and moving forward with them. And then I started to, after becoming certified and doing more self-exploration, I started to really dig into some of the regions and countries that people didn't really talk about a lot when it comes to wine education. And that meant also digging into South Africa, where I discovered some of the most beautiful Chenin Blanc, some of the most beautiful Syrah, some of the most beautiful sparkling wines. And you know what? It just goes to show sometimes it's worthwhile doing the exploration on your own and not taking everybody else's word for it. You may find by going deep and digging down that little rabbit hole, you're going to find a producer in a region that really sings to you and matches your profile on your palate. So I encourage you to explore and discover on your own. It's what you like. Wine is personal. Wine is just about you. It's about what you like and what makes you happy and what you want to break open when you're sitting around that dinner table. So cheers again. I'm going back to drink my South African Shiraz. And that's the last word.